Thank you very much, David. It struck me, I first met David 40 years ago, and I find it deeply depressing how similar he looks today than he did 40 years ago. So, David, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to what is a really exciting meeting. And it's always horrible following David, who puts up wonderful pictures of large felids and things, and there won't be many of them in my talk, but I want to talk about something which is incredibly important for anyone who cares about conservation, as you all do and I do, and that is food. And my talk is going to be in three parts. First of all, I'm going to do some framing, some of the issues around food at the moment. I'm then going to briefly talk about some modelling, some research we've done in the UK, in Oxford, about some of the challenges ahead, trying to project the food system into the future. And then I'm going to finish with what I think are a couple of the most salient action points in the food conservation sphere. Now, I'm, by background, a population biologist, and the founder of my field is Thomas Malthus, also one of the sort of major founders of economics. And Malthus is famous for his 1798 essay on the principles of population, where he argued, going against the spirit of the time, it was a time when there's a lot of hope for progress, and he argued that the capacity of population, human populations, to increase geometrically would outstrip the capacity of the land to feed those populations. He argued that food production went up arithmetically. And he was predicting major famines in the early part of the 19th century. And this didn't happen. It didn't happen for complex reasons around the Industrial Revolution. I should pause that there were famines, and of course, any of you from Ireland will know about that, but that was a political famine rather than a failure of the capacity to feed. So this is what I call the first of three waves of Malthusian pessimism, and the Industrial Revolution met that one. The second, I'm old enough to remember it, it was during the 1970s, when one had books such as The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, The Club of Rome. I reread The Population Bomb recently for an article I was asked to write, and it is extraordinary reading it later, sort of a call for coercive population control, something that would not have happened now. And there was a clear logic for it at the time. But the predictions that Ehrlich was making predictions of the failure of democracy in Europe. In this country, it came sort of 20 years later. He was predicting it by the turn of the century. He was predicting massive famines throughout the rich world. And this didn't happen. It didn't happen because of the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution was the advances in agriculture, especially in plant breeding, that meant as population went up, productivity, crop productivity, not only kept pace, but it was an advance of population. And although we did bring more area into agriculture, the increase in agricultural area over this period from 1960 to this is about 2010 was only about 12%. Of course, and this has really major consequences for conservation, the use of fertilizer and the concomitant nitrogen phosphorus runoff was enormous. So this was the second wave of Malthusian pessimism, and as I said, this was largely matched by the Green Revolution. The third wave, sorry, this hasn't come out quite well, it looks a bit ugly there. The third wave is very recent. In 2008 and 2010, we had an uptick in food prices. This is the FAO Food Price Index. I've given nominal and real. Real is deflated by US inflation. And there's arguments that actually, if you're a poor person in sub-Saharan Africa, nominal is more what you experience than deflating by US inflation. So the reality is somewhere in the middle. So we saw, after a period of relative food price stability since the 1970s, we saw this uptick, which led to a series of political disruptions. The causes of the Arab Spring were manifold, but an increase in food prices was one of them. And it's interesting, if one looks at food prices over the course of the 20th century, the volatility around about 2008 was small compared with world wars and the oil crisis, but yet it did bring back food into the political pushed it right up the political agenda. And people again began to have conversations, Malthusian conversations. Now, as a population biologist, the most extraordinary thing that has happened in my intellectual adult lifetime is that the demographic transition has happened. When Ehrlich and people like that were writing in the 1970s, we did not know that if you did things right, if you brought people out of poverty, if you provided access to reproductive health care, if you educated kids, especially girls, then population will go down. And as many people, Hans Rosling perhaps most famously has pointed out, we know good things will happen because of demographic inertia. But again, a real big issue, you can see the confidence limits there. We don't know where population is going to asymptote. So to me, as a population biologist, it's extraordinarily encouraging that one can intellectually talk about a time when human population may plateau, and one can talk legitimately about that there will be a time where the load that human population puts on the natural world may plateau. But it's everything to play for, but it is a really critical time. What happens in the next half century will essentially determine what happens for centuries after that. And food is a really critical part of this. And so just finishing this first part and just sort of summarizing some of the drivers, some of the challenges. We'll see continuing demand growth, partly from populations, but also from richer people, and it's a good thing coming out of policy demanding more. Urbanization and megacities, hunger and undernutrition. We have made tremendous progress in hunger and nutrition. Most of the 800 million people who sadly go to bed calories short each night, they go there because of political reasons. They live in war zones, they live in areas of civil conflict, although there is much to do. I do have a mammal here, this is my slide for obesity. Suddenly out of nowhere, the obesity epidemic affecting poor countries as well as rich countries. And again, you'll know many of the other pressures. Pressures of agriculture and water scarcity, competition for land and soil. And this issue, very germane to what you're talking about today, which is the geopolitics, climate change, the human capacity to respond to challenges in a sensible way. When there's a food price shock, we often respond through political expediency rather than through logic. So that's a framing of some of the issues. And in the second part of the talk, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing in Oxford in a group called the Future of Food Programme. And this is very much a collaboration with the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington. And I'm going to say nothing about the suite of models. They're economic models with health models and some both economic and environmental outcomes. But I would call out the two postdocs, Marco Springman and Daniel Mason de Cruz. Daniel is now at CSIRO, who have done the hard work on this. So I'm going to just ask two questions. And the first is a question around co-benefits. And I think this is one of the points that I want to argue strongly in this talk, that we talk about win-wins, and often win-wins are illusory, but there are some real win-wins in food and conservation. Now, having said that, I'm going to talk about the co-benefits of eating healthily, and I'm going to focus in greenhouse gas emissions. We're actually trying to do this for biodiversity as well, and it's harder to do for biodiversity. Greenhouse gas emissions are to an extent fungible, so they're easier to analyze. But our initial results coming through is that what I'm saying here, the co-benefits of eating healthily and for greenhouse gas emissions, we think it's going to be pretty much the same for biodiversity outcomes as well. So very briefly, what I'm going to do is we have our model, and again, I'm very happy to talk about that in the break if people want to know more about it. And we want to say, well, what happens if we switch our diets to the type of healthy diets that the World Health Organization recommends? And we do this in a reasonably sophisticated way. We don't assume everyone everywhere eats the same things. We assume those diets happen in a regional way. And then we calculate diet-related diseases using our epidemiological health model. We look at greenhouse gas emissions. And we begin to explore economics. I'm going to talk very briefly about economic co-benefits, but with a lot of caveats about it. So I'm going to show a couple of maps of the world, and we contacted the Foreign Office to ask them for their latest map of the world, and here it was, and then we noticed a slight geographic anomaly, so we actually put it back where we thought corrected that. So what we did is we assumed that people ate the WHO healthy diet, and then we used our health module to calculate the deaths avoided. So there are many diet-related deaths, and we asked how many of them would be avoided. Of course, we all die from something, but this is you're dying for something else not diet-related deaths. And so if you do this, if you make the assumption, and it is a big assumption that by mid-century we eat a healthy diet, then you get this figure here of about 5.1 million people avoided deaths. Now, what does that mean? Well, my other day job is working on the mosquitoes that transmit malaria. I'm an entomologist by background. And I say this with huge respect for the people involved, but the deaths from malaria a year is round about 500,000. And so we're talking about 10 times more than the worst vector-borne disease. Now, of course, it's a bit different because it tends to be young people who die from malaria. So again, with huge respect for people who are affected by both, that gives you some sort of framing of what that figure is. If you look at the darkness of the green is where the most lives are saved. And perhaps curiously, a lot of it is in the developed world. And that is because our diets in the developed world are so poor. If you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, then again, switching to a healthy diet, the growth in greenhouse gas emissions from now to mid-century, we expect it to be 50% from the food system, it goes down to 7%. Now, that's not enough, but that's purely diet change before you do anything else. And you can see that in many of the poorest countries where there is still calorie hunger, we expect people to have a greater greenhouse gas footprint from their diet. And it would be socially unethical and inequitable to expect otherwise. But there is a very substantial environment and health co-benefit. And if you look at the economics, and I'm going to say very little about it, so if you use social cost of carbon, if you use indirect costs, direct and indirect costs of healthcare, and if you try some of these hedonic measures, what you would pay for those extra lives, you get major benefits as well. And as I said, we're working to try and bring biodiversity into this. It's much harder because it's local, but I think we'll get the same picture. Food and planetary boundaries. I'm going to talk about some work that we did that underlined the recent Eat Lancet report on diets and things. And you'll be aware of the planetary boundary framing that Johan Rockström and others have brought up. And you can criticize the planetary boundaries. You know, is it really a boundary? Surely it's all integral. But nevertheless, it's been a fabulous tool in concentrating the minds of many policy makers. If you look at many of the planetary boundaries, they're affected by food. We looked at 5: climate change, land use, water use, and phosphorus and nitrogen. Biosphere integrity, biodiversity, again, food affects it, but we didn't have the tools in order to look at it. And what we did is we said, well, of the pressure on these 5 planetary boundaries, how much of it is due to food? And then within that food component, what parts of the food system are really pressurizing the environment? Now, this is a complex graph, and I'm not going to talk all the way through it. But look at greenhouse gas emissions at the top there. This is what happens now, and that red bar there is livestock production. So the way the food affects greenhouse gas emissions is largely through livestock production, and we expect it to grow through mid-century. This is land use, crop land use. Well, livestock's also important there, but yellow is growing arable crops and things. So arable crops, and some of these are used for livestock as well, but that's accounted for here, again has a major effect on this boundary. And I'll just choose one other, and this is freshwater use, blue water use. The green bar there, that's fruit and vegetables. We need to eat more fruit and vegetables, but fruit and vegetables tend to have a greater effect on water use. So this is beginning to partition the effect of the food system on different components of the planetary boundaries. And then we did a sort of scenario where we looked at different things you could do. And we looked at 4 things, of which I'm only going to talk about 2. So we looked at reducing loss and waste, and that's just a good thing to do. We assumed what happens if we can reduce food waste by 1/2. We looked at technology, so we took current trends in increasing in productivity and asked what would happen if we doubled them. And that is purely, that's very deliverable if one increased investment. There are fairly straightforward econometric relationships between the two, and although there is a ceiling, we believe we are some way from it. We looked about diet change, and we didn't suggest going vegetarian or vegan. We said if you went to a flexitarian lifestyle, so that's a substantial reduction in meat, but not a complete reduction. And I won't talk about some of the socioeconomic things. And again, you can see what makes the biggest difference. So what makes the biggest difference for greenhouse gas emissions is diet change. And what makes the biggest difference from cropland, blue water, also nitrogen and phosphorus is increasing in productivity. So to finish, what I think needs to be done, well, many things need to be done. I'm going to pick out 2 things. The first is what we have called in numerous reports, some of which I put there, sustainable intensification. Real research to produce more crops from the same agricultural footprint. Now this is controversial. Compassion and Well Farming called it an oxymoron. We had a really interesting discussion with them. As a natural scientist, I think my community sometimes forgets how important words are. And especially in the livestock humanitarian world, intensification is synonymous with poor welfare. The Friends of the Earth produced a report that sustainable intensification is wolf in sheep's clothing. Friends of the Earth does some really great things, but I thought this was a pretty terrible report. It was just an argument against GM. You can have sustainable intensification without GM. Sustainable intensification is a goal, not a trajectory. It's up to us as civil society to argue about what should be in that, what should be the set of possible tools. I'll be very clear, I think GM should be part of it, but if you disagree, I respect that, and it's up to us in a democracy to decide which should be in. I think many of the people who worry about sustainable intensification see sustainable intensification as largely intensification and not sustainable. Those of you at the back, that's sustainable deliberately in small words. To me, the huge goal for sustainable intensification, were one able to do it, is that not only would one be increasing food production, but one would be giving the headroom to do other things with agriculture. And some of that would be to take land out of agriculture or not to convert it. And some of it would be to produce food in ways that maximizes biodiversity. And I just call out, I don't know if there's anyone from Andrew Barmsley's group from Cambridge here, but Ben Phelan and Andrew and his colleagues, I think, have done some really interesting work in trying to put some numbers on what that actually means. And I think the Cambridge research shows that if one's talking about tropical rainforests, then having a strategy where one puts agricultural land in one place in order to preserve as much rainforest as possible, the data clearly shows that is better. But it's going to be much more complex when one gets to, say, Mediterranean farming ecosystems. This is from the Westgate Conservancy just outside Samburu National Park, where you have goats there and sharing it with Brevis zebra, the very rare zebra. And there are lions there, but you don't see them very often because they're spending most of their time avoiding David and his colleagues putting collars on them. And the second thing that we have to think about is diet change. And this comes round to meat as well. So if you look at, this is actually a few years old. In developed nations, the amount of meat is going down a bit. It's going up in China. We have to have conversations about meat, and we have to do that respecting people, for example, the pastoralists in northern Kenya, who absolutely require meat. So we have to have a nuanced conversation distinguishing what happens in the rich world from the poor world. And I'm running out of time, so I won't talk about it now, but there's some really interesting things around plant-based cultured meat, insects, and mycoproteins, and we've just done a report on that, if you're, which I can talk about if you're interested. What I haven't talked about today, which is really important and will be the subject of a lot of the rest of the conference, is the social economics and governance issues, how critically important they were. And to conclude, really three things. First of all, the food system is entering uncharted waters. The next 50 years will determine whether we have slain Malthusianism or not. We don't have the luxury to say diet change, agriculture, governance. None of those things alone will provide enough food that we still have some space for nature. We have to have action on all fronts. And finally, if we fail on food, we fail on everything. I'm a biodiversity person. I'm a biologist by background. I care deeply about biodiversity, as do all of you. But we can essentially give up on biodiversity unless we provide enough food to feed the world. And I think one of the most encouraging things of the last decade is how the biodiversity and the food world have got together and are having a dialogue that you just didn't get 10 or 15 years ago. Forgive me, I've gone 1 minute over. Thanks very much indeed.
Triumph. Thank you, Charles. We are fighting the clock. Time for one question for Charles Godfrey. By the way, don't despair, because this evening there's a panel discussion which will allow you to interact much more with the plenary speakers, as well as coffee breaks and so forth. But anyway, quick question. Amy.
How impactful do you think the adoption of artificial meat and cultured meat would be in reducing things like those greenhouse gas emissions if it became more widely adopted by 2050?
That's a really interesting question. The initial assessments of how much greenhouse gas you would save from moving to cultured meat, our recent analysis suggests that they were overestimated. I'm still quite optimistic that one can bring down the greenhouse gas emissions from cultured meat. I think this will happen. There's a lot of money going into it. I think the really critical thing is, will it just stay as a sort of middle class thing, sort of high income thing, or will the economics come down so that it can be mass produced? Will the social science, will it go yuck, or will it go virtuous? And when you do bring the economies of scale down, whether you bring the environmental outputs down as well.
Thank you, Charles.